In Pineville, a town cloaked in tranquility, life moves slowly. Yet, beneath the calm facade, secrets stir, hidden scars waiting to resurface. In this seemingly perfect place, a tale of love, betrayal, and redemption unfolds, where ordinary lives will be changed forever by the consequences of long-buried truths. Emma, only 6, hides her pain behind quiet eyes, while Sarah, her mother, battles daily to protect their fragile world. When they find a dog buried in the mud, a simple discovery shatters their reality, unearthing buried secrets that threaten to tear apart their family and the town itself. Before you watch, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from and hit that like button if you enjoy heartfelt, courageous stories. In the quiet town of Pineville, where the hum of life is steady and predictable, Sarah found herself caught in a ceaseless cycle of exhaustion and determination. The small diner on the corner of Maple Street, where she worked long hours as a waitress, was her first job. She would serve coffee, eggs, and pancakes to the locals, listening to their mundane chatter about crops, weather, and the town's gossip. Then, after her shift ended, she would head across the street to the convenience store, where the night shift awaited her. It was a never-ending rhythm, the workwear now permanently etched into her skin. The smell of coffee and stale cigarettes lingered even after she'd finally closed her eyes to sleep. Sarah wasn't just working to survive. She was working to give Emma a life, a future beyond the crushing weight of their reality. She wanted to shield her daughter from the world's sharp edges, especially the ones that had cut them both so deeply. But even in the softest corners of Pineville, Sarah knew she couldn't escape the remnants of the storm that had ravaged their family. That storm was named Derek, her late husband, Emma's father. His death, sudden and tragic, had cast a shadow over their lives that no amount of work or new routines could ever seem to lift. She had hoped for peace, for healing. But what she got instead was silence. A deafening silence that hung between her and Emma like a thick fog. Emma hadn't spoken a word since the day Derek died. The incident, a car crash, had stolen not only Derek from their lives, but also Emma's ability to communicate. At first, Sarah thought it was just shock, a temporary reaction. But as days turned into weeks, weeks into months, Emma's silence became a cold, impenetrable wall. It hurt Sarah deeply, but she did her best to mask it with a smile, to act as if everything was fine, as if the silence didn't cut into her heart every single day. Emma was a bright child, once full of laughter, with a curious mind that could solve puzzles faster than Sarah could keep up. She had been her father's daughter, his pride and joy. But now, Emma rarely smiled. Her wide, dark eyes were filled with a deep, unspoken sadness that only Sarah could recognize. She could see the battle inside her daughter, the struggle to make sense of a world that had taken away the one person who had made her feel safe. Sarah didn't blame Emma for her silence. She understood it all too well. But it didn't stop the ache that gnawed at her, the fear that Emma would never be able to heal. Every night, after putting Emma to bed, Sarah would sit by the window, watching the stars twinkle in the sky, wondering where her life had gone wrong. She would hold the silver locket that Derek had given her, the one she wore around her neck every day, and think about what could have been. In her quiet moments, she questioned herself. Was there something she could have done to prevent the accident? Had she been too caught up in her own dreams, too focused on their future, to see the cracks that had started to form in their marriage? But then, just as the self-doubt started to creep in, she would look at Emma's face, peaceful in sleep, and push the thoughts away. She had to be strong for Emma. She had to believe that things would get better. Every day, she tried to make her daughter feel safe. She made their home as cozy as possible, filling it with comforting routines. Breakfast at the kitchen table, walks in the park after school, the soft hum of the radio in the background while they worked on puzzles together. Sarah did everything she could to fill the void left by Derek's absence, even though the emptiness seemed impossible to overcome. Still, there were moments, small moments, when Sarah's heart would break all over again. Like when Emma's eyes would linger on the empty chair at the dinner table, the one that used to be filled by her father. Or when they would pass the small park near their house, and Emma would stare longingly at the swings, as if she were waiting for something or someone to return. Despite the crushing silence, Sarah never stopped hoping. She held on to the belief that one day Emma would speak again. Maybe it would be a word, a sentence, or even just a whisper. But until then, Sarah did what she could. She worked tirelessly, putting in every hour she had, saving what little they could. She made sure Emma had the best of what she could afford. Good clothes, healthy meals, a cozy room to sleep in. But beyond the material things, Sarah knew there was something much more important that her daughter needed: healing. She just didn't know how to give it to her. The weight of their shared grief was a burden Sarah carried alone, but she did so with quiet resilience. She never let Emma see the tears that sometimes came late at night. She didn't want Emma to feel the burden of her mother's sadness. As tired as she was, Sarah continued to put on a brave face, to keep the hope alive that somehow, some way, they would find their way back to each other. The road was long and the pain was deep, but for Emma, Sarah was determined to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. Pineville was the kind of town people passed through without giving much thought. It was small, the streets lined with modest homes and overgrown trees, offering a calm and inviting atmosphere. For the residents, it was home, a place to raise families, share meals, and find peace in the simple rhythms of daily life. Yet beneath the placid surface, there was an undercurrent of something unsettling. A quiet tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud that never quite broke. It wasn't something that could be easily identified. It was more of a feeling, a sense of discomfort that even newcomers could sense after living there for a while. Pineville was a town that kept its secrets well. People tended to keep their heads down, avoiding confrontation and rarely questioning the things that lurked just beneath the surface. The residents weren't unfriendly, but there was always a sense that no one wanted to look too closely at what was happening behind closed doors. Even Sarah, who had lived there for years, could feel it, like something was just out of reach, hidden from view, but constantly lurking. It was on one of the rare rainy mornings that the town's hidden darkness began to surface, when a discovery in the outskirts of Pineville would change everything. Luna, a pregnant German shepherd, was found half buried in the thick mud near a small abandoned farm on the edge of town. She had been left for dead, her body weak, her fur matted and caked with dirt. At first glance, she seemed like any other stray animal, helpless, broken, and alone. But as people gathered around to help her, it became clear that something was wrong. Something much darker was at play. Luna's condition was far worse than what would be expected for an abandoned dog. She was malnourished, her ribs visible beneath her fur, but it was the way she had been treated that disturbed those who found her. The marks on her body were unmistakable, scars from restraints, bruises from too many hits. And then there was the unmistakable sight of her swollen belly, evidence that she had been forced into pregnancy, her body a casualty of something much larger than simple neglect. The town rallied to help her, as townsfolk often did when tragedy struck. But the more they learned about Luna, the more unsettling the truth became. Luna wasn't just any stray. She had been part of something far more sinister, a project shrouded in secrecy and long whispered about in hushed tones, one that involved animal testing, and by extension, questions that no one seemed to want answered. The project, known only by its codename Endurance, had begun years before in the outskirts of Pineville. At its core, it was a test of animal loyalty and resilience, a series of cruel and unethical experiments designed to measure the endurance of animals when subjected to extreme conditions. Luna had been one of many dogs chosen for this program. She had been bred and trained to endure, subjected to physical and mental stress beyond the limits of what any creature should endure. She was a part of the system, a cog in a machine designed to test the very limits of life and death, to see how far loyalty could go and what sacrifices it could demand. When Luna's body began to show signs that she could no longer meet the expectations of the project, she was abandoned, discarded as if her life held no more value. Her pregnancy had been a result of forced breeding, another facet of the project's twisted methods. The town didn't know the full extent of what had happened behind the closed doors of the facility, but they did know that Luna wasn't the only victim. There were others, dogs, cats, and other animals, used and discarded once their value had run out. The town had been complicit, too silent in the face of cruelty, looking the other way when things didn't seem right. Pineville's dark secret had been buried in plain sight for years. When Luna was found, the truth began to slowly unravel. At first, there were only rumors, whispers in the back rooms of the diner, half-formed accusations that nobody wanted to believe. But the evidence was clear. Luna's scars, the marks of her ordeal, the fact that she was carrying puppies in a place so far removed from the safety of a home, everything pointed back to that ill-fated project. It had been shut down quietly, swept under the rug, its participants never held accountable. The facility had been abandoned, its records destroyed, and those who had been involved moved away, blending back into the community as if nothing had happened. But Luna, broken and battered, was a reminder. She was living proof of the horrors that had taken place just beyond Pineville's borders, proof that no amount of silence could erase the past. And her presence in the town brought with it more questions than answers. Who had done this to her? Why was she left to die, her body discarded like trash? And how many more were there, suffering in silence, waiting for the right moment to be found? For Sarah, the discovery of Luna was the first crack in the town's facade. She could no longer ignore the whispers, the vague unease that she had always felt. Luna's story was just the beginning, the spark that would ignite the darker truths hidden beneath Pineville's seemingly peaceful exterior. As the town began to learn more about the German Shepherd's tragic past, it became clear that Pineville's innocence had been shattered, and the consequences of its silence would echo far beyond that rainy morning. The woods surrounding Pineville had always been a place of quiet solace for Emma. She would wander there, her small feet crunching softly against the underbrush, her mind adrift as she allowed the sounds of nature to fill the silence that had settled between her and the rest of the world. The towering trees, their branches swaying in the wind, seemed to understand her in ways that no one else could. It was in these woods that Emma found peace, where her thoughts could float freely without the weight of words. But today was different. Today, something inside her tugged her deeper into the woods, a pull that was not of her own making, something strange yet undeniably urgent. It was a sensation she couldn't explain, a quiet beckoning like a whisper calling her name from far off. Her curiosity, as always, led her forward. Emma knew the woods well, but this time the trees seemed to shift around her, their shadows longer and darker than usual. A low wind hummed through the branches, carrying with it a chill that made her shiver. Yet, she couldn't stop herself. She had to go. Her little legs carried her farther than she'd intended, and before she realized it, she had reached the outskirts of the woods, near the old, abandoned farm on the town's edge. It was a place no one visited anymore, a forgotten piece of Pineville's history, its fields overgrown with weeds and the crumbling remnants of long-abandoned barns standing like forgotten sentinels. Emma stopped at the edge of the clearing, the faintest hint of mud squelching beneath her shoes as she peered into the distance. The pull was stronger now, tugging at her chest. Then she saw it. A shape, half buried in the thick mud near a rotting fence post. It was a flash of movement, something struggling, something alive. Her heart raced. She stepped closer, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder, unsure of what she had found. The form in the mud was too strange to ignore, too urgent to walk away from. It was a dog, a German Shepherd, its large body mired in mud, its fur caked with the dark, wet earth. The dog was struggling, its legs kicking weakly, as though trying to free itself from an invisible weight. Emma's eyes widened in disbelief. The dog's swollen belly, the unmistakable signs of pregnancy, made her gasp. The dog was trapped, desperate for help, and Emma's heart surged with the instinct to save it. Without hesitation, she knelt in the mud, her small hands trembling as she began to dig frantically, scooping away the earth around the dog's body. The mud clung to her fingers, the coldness sinking into her bones. But Emma didn't stop. She dug deeper, her mind focused solely on the creature before her, the distress in its eyes pulling her forward. She had no idea how long she worked, her hands raw and slick with the mud. But there was no time to think. There was only the urgency of the dog's struggles, the helplessness of the situation, and the instinctive drive to save it. "Please, please," Emma whispered to the dog, her voice a soft tremor. "Hold on, just a little longer." The dog's eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart ache. It was as if it recognized her, as if it understood that Emma was the one who could help. The animal's panting grew more labored, and Emma worked faster, pulling at the mud with everything she had. She could feel the weight of the dog's body, its strength waning, but she didn't let herself falter. She couldn't. It was then that the dog let out a soft whine, its movements slowing, its head falling to the ground as if surrendering. Emma's chest tightened in fear. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but she knew she couldn't let the dog give up. She couldn't let this creature, this life, slip away. With a final, desperate push, Emma freed the dog from the mud's suffocating grip. The shepherd's body collapsed onto the ground, its breathing shallow, but still alive. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she scooted closer to the animal, her tiny hands gently petting its fur. The mud that coated its coat stuck to her fingertips, but it didn't matter. The dog was free. She could hear the animal's soft, shallow breaths, the faint rasp of air pulling in and out of its body. But it was still alive. Emma's eyes filled with tears, not from fear or sadness, but from a deep, urgent relief. The dog was going to be okay. For a long moment, Emma sat there, cradling the dog's head in her lap, as the wind rustled the leaves overhead. The world around her seemed to slow, the moment suspended in time. And in that moment, Emma realized something. The pull that had led her into the woods, that had guided her to this very spot, it wasn't just the wind or a simple accident. It was something else. She had been meant to find Luna. But as she sat there, the dog's labored breathing still in her lap, Emma couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning. Luna, as the dog had been named in her mind, wasn't just a stray animal. She was part of something deeper, something that Emma couldn't understand yet, but that would soon become clear. The truth of the dog's past, of the suffering she had endured, and the secrets hidden in Pineville, everything was about to surface. Emma looked down at Luna's face, her eyes wide with a newfound determination. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. Everything was about to pour. Sarah had always trusted Emma's quiet nature. She had learned to recognize the moments when her daughter needed space and when she needed her. But today, as she stood in the doorway of their home, watching the rain gently fall, something felt wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled with an unsettling sense of unease, and her instincts told her something wasn't right. Emma had gone off to play, but it had been too long, and Sarah hadn't heard her voice. Panic crept up her spine. She called out her daughter's name, but the house remained eerily silent. Sarah felt her heart race as she grabbed her coat and stepped out into the cool air. The woods were just a short walk away, her daughter's favorite place to wander when she needed peace. She hurried toward the forest, her pace quickening as the worry settled deeper into her chest. "Emma," she called again, louder this time, her voice tight with fear. She hadn't expected Emma to disappear like this. Something had to be wrong. The woods were quiet, too quiet, as Sarah pushed her way through the underbrush. She could feel the dampness of the earth beneath her boots, the cool air pressing in from all sides, but her mind was fixed on one thing: finding Emma. She called her name again, but there was no response. Her heart hammered in her chest, the worry and fear swirling in a tight knot. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A flash of red in the distance, Emma's small figure just beyond the trees. Relief flooded through Sarah, but it was short-lived. As she hurried toward Emma, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her daughter was kneeling in the mud, her small hands covered in dirt, cradling something in her lap. Sarah's heart stopped. "Emma," she shouted, her voice shaky with a mix of concern and confusion. Emma looked up at her, her wide eyes filled with something that Sarah couldn't quite place: fear, determination, and a strange kind of calm. "Mom," Emma said, her voice small but steady, "I found her." Sarah's gaze followed Emma's pointed finger, and that's when she saw the dog. A German shepherd, half buried in the mud, her body weak and trembling. Sarah's breath hitched as she recognized the faint signs of pregnancy. The dog's fur was matted and dark with dirt, and she was barely moving. Her eyes, though, were wide open, staring at Emma with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. There was no time to waste. "Emma," Sarah said, her voice urgent, "we need to help her. Now." Without another word, she dropped to her knees beside Emma, her hands shaking as she reached out to gently touch the dog. The animal flinched at first, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, something that told Sarah that this dog, too, wanted to survive. Sarah's protective instincts kicked in, overriding the panic that still gripped her chest. She had to save this dog. She had to protect it, just like she protected Emma. Together, Sarah and Emma worked quickly, pulling the mud away, their hands sinking deep into the earth. The dog's body was so weak, and every movement seemed like an effort, but Sarah could feel a spark of life in her, a flicker of hope that urged her to keep going. Emma didn't say much as they worked, but her actions spoke volumes. She was focused, determined, and her small hands were steady as she helped dig away the layers of wet earth. Sarah's mind raced as she watched Emma. It was almost as if her daughter had found her own sense of purpose in this moment, as though the silence that had surrounded her for so long had been replaced by something else, something that drove her to act with more courage than Sarah had ever seen in her before. Her daughter, despite the grief that had taken root in her heart, was finding her voice again. In this moment, Emma was not the broken child she had become after Derek's death. She was something else, something fierce and strong. Finally, after what felt like hours of digging, the dog was free. She collapsed onto the ground, her body heaving with shallow breaths. Sarah moved quickly, lifting the dog's head gently into her lap, her hands soft and careful as she checked for injuries. The mud was caked in her fur, her body so thin that Sarah could feel the sharpness of her ribs beneath the skin. The dog was in critical condition, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. "We need to get her back to the house," Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. She could hear the faint sound of Emma's breath, her daughter's gaze still fixed on the dog. But then, Sarah's hand brushed against the dog's swollen belly, and her heart skipped a beat. The reality of the situation hit her all at once. The dog wasn't just malnourished, she was pregnant. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The urgency of the situation had escalated in an instant. Not only did the dog need immediate care, but she needed a safe place to deliver her puppies. The complications of a late-term pregnancy in such a weakened state could be dangerous. "We have to get her home, Emma," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We'll help her, I promise, but we need to move quickly." Together they gently lifted the dog, supporting her fragile body as they carefully made their way back to their home. The journey was slow, and Sarah's thoughts raced. She had no idea how Luna, the dog, had ended up in the woods, why she was left in such a condition, or what kind of past she had endured. But one thing was certain, she wasn't about to let the dog suffer. As they entered the house, Sarah's thoughts shifted toward the bigger picture. She had no idea what kind of darkness had brought Luna to this point, but she knew that finding this dog was no coincidence. Something larger, something buried deep in Pineville's secrets was coming to the surface, and Emma, with her quiet strength, had just started unraveling it. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead. They had to. Please, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional, thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us bring more amazing content to you. As Sarah settled Luna into the spare room, the weight of what she had just uncovered continued to press heavily on her chest. She had seen dogs abandoned before, the strays that wandered through Pineville, each one with a sad story and a yearning for a home. But Luna wasn't like those dogs. There was something in her eyes, something haunted that suggested a past far darker and more sinister than any strays. The dog's condition, too, was far worse than the usual neglect. Luna's ribs were painfully visible beneath her fur, her body trembling from more than just the cold. The marks on her skin, the deep bruises and scars, spoke of a kind of cruelty that Sarah couldn't ignore. The more she thought about it, the more her suspicions grew. As she and Emma carefully washed the mud from Luna's coat, Sarah's thoughts churned. She could tell this dog had been through something terrible, something far beyond the neglect of an irresponsible owner. But where had she come from? Why had someone gone to such lengths to abandon her in such a critical condition? That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing. Her fingers drummed anxiously against the wood, and her eyes kept drifting toward the window. The cold rain continued to pour outside, a relentless reminder of the turmoil that had somehow found its way into their quiet town. She thought about Luna, her eyes bright with an unspoken history, and the mystery of the pregnancy that had only heightened Sarah's sense of urgency. The way Luna had looked at her and Emma, almost pleading, made Sarah wonder if the dog knew she was being cared for out of more than just kindness. There was something more, a silent bond between them that she couldn't quite explain. Suddenly it hit her. There had been rumors, whispers, about a controversial government project in the area. People had talked about it for years, but no one ever spoke openly about it. The project, so shrouded in secrecy, had been linked to animal testing, a program involving animals subjected to extreme physical and mental stress. It was said to be funded by the government, aimed at creating more resilient, loyal animals for military purposes. But the details were always vague. Could Luna have been part of that program? Sarah's blood ran cold as she pieced together the fragments of information she'd overheard over the years. She remembered the whispers about animals going missing, of strange research facilities being set up outside town limits, of people disappearing without a trace, only to reappear with new names and new identities. There had been talk of a secret military project, one so hush-hush that no one had dared to investigate. She couldn't ignore the unsettling thought that the dog in her care might be a casualty of that very program. The next morning, with Luna resting quietly in the spare room, Sarah set out to uncover the truth. She couldn't just leave things as they were. Luna's suffering, the way she had been discarded, deserved an explanation. Sarah made her way to the town library. The air was damp as she stepped inside, the scent of aged paper and dust greeting her as she approached the librarian's desk. The old woman behind the counter greeted her with a nod, but there was something unreadable in her eyes. It was as though she knew why Sarah was there and knew that asking the wrong questions could lead to trouble. "I need to know more about Pineville's history," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Specifically, about any government projects that might have been run here. Anything connected to animals or military tests." The librarian hesitated, her fingers tapping nervously against the surface of her desk. "You're asking about something dangerous," she said quietly, lowering her voice. "Some things are better left in the past, Sarah. You're not going to find what you're looking for here." "I have to know," Sarah replied, her voice firm now. "For Luna. For what happened to her." The librarian stared at her for a moment before finally nodding. "There's a file in the back. It's not something we keep in the public records, but I've seen it. I can't give it to you, but I can point you in the right direction." With that, she led Sarah down a narrow corridor in the back of the library to a small dusty room filled with old files and forgotten documents. The librarian gestured toward a box on the floor, one labeled with nothing more than a faded black marker, its contents completely nondescript. "I can't tell you much more," she whispered, "but it's in there. Just be careful." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She crouched down and carefully pulled open the box. Inside, she found newspaper clippings, old reports, and a stack of documents covered in government seals. The words were difficult to read. The paper yellowed with age, but as she flipped through the pages, she began to uncover fragments of the truth. The files were a record of the very project she had heard whispered about. Project Endurance. It had been a government-funded initiative that used animals in brutal experiments, pushing them to their physical and mental limits to test their loyalty, obedience, and endurance. The animals involved were subjected to grueling conditions, forced to survive extreme heat and cold, isolation and hunger, all in the name of military research. Luna's breed, the German Shepherd, was one of the most sought-after dogs for the program. They were trained for military purposes, taught to endure, to follow commands without question, to fight for their handlers no matter the cost. Luna, it seemed, had been one of the dogs chosen for this program. She had been bred specifically for it. Her loyalty, her ability to withstand pain, were supposed to make her the perfect candidate. But the reports revealed something else. Luna had failed the tests. She had become too weak, too broken, to continue the program. And like the others before her, she had been discarded, left to fend for herself, abandoned and left to die. Sarah's hands shook as she finished reading the last of the papers. The anger surged through her, hot and fierce. Luna had been treated like an object, something to be used, broken, and cast aside when she was no longer useful. The people responsible for this, whoever they were, hadn't cared. They had only seen Luna as a tool, a thing to be exploited. And the more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just Luna they had abandoned. It was everything the town stood for. Everything Pineville had been built on: secrecy, compliance, and silence in the face of cruelty. She clenched her fists, her mind made up. It was time to uncover the truth. Time to hold the people who had done this accountable. And Sarah was going to make sure they didn't get away with it. As Sarah sat at the table, her mind swirling with the details of the documents she had uncovered, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. She had known that the death of Emma's father, Derek, had left a deep scar in their lives. But until now, she hadn't understood just how connected his death was to the shadows lurking beneath Pineville. Derek had always been a man of integrity, a man who refused to look the other way when something wasn't right. And now, as the truth started to surface, it was clear that his refusal to stay silent had cost him everything. The memory of that day, the day Sarah had learned about Derek's death, still haunted her. It had been a cold evening, one of those rare nights when the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of their home. Derek had been working late, as usual, his mind often consumed by the things he couldn't speak about. He worked as an investigative journalist, and although Sarah didn't always know the specifics, she had always sensed that his work sometimes brought him too close to dangerous people. Derek never wanted her to worry, always reassuring her that it was just part of the job. But deep down, Sarah had known that something was off. That night, Derek had come home later than expected, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't said much, just kissed Sarah on the forehead and told her he was going to bed early. She had assumed it was another late night, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. The next morning, Sarah woke to find him gone. The police report stated that Derek had died in a car accident on a lonely stretch of road just outside of town. The details were vague, and the investigation had been quick, too quick for Sarah's liking. The car had crashed into a tree, and there were no signs of foul play. Just a tragedy. They told her it was a result of a late-night drive, a momentary lapse in judgment. But Sarah knew better. Derek had always been a careful driver, a cautious man who would never make such a mistake. The idea of him crashing on that road with no one around to help didn't sit right with her. A few weeks after the funeral, Sarah had stumbled across a small notebook hidden in Derek's things. It was filled with cryptic notes, names of people Sarah didn't recognize, and references to something called Project Endurance. She had initially dismissed it as part of his investigation into some military scandal. But as she flipped through the pages, she noticed a disturbing pattern. Derek had been digging into the very project that was now linked to Luna: the animal testing, the government's involvement, and the cover-ups that had been happening right under their noses. There was a note in the back of the notebook that stood out, written in Derek's neat handwriting. "They know I'm getting too close. I'm not going to back down, no matter what." Sarah's stomach twisted as she realized that Derek had uncovered something so dangerous, so explosive, that someone had been willing to silence him to protect the truth. His death, she was now certain, had not been an accident. It had been a warning, a consequence of his refusal to stay quiet about the illegal activities taking place right beneath their feet. As the pieces clicked into place, Sarah understood the deep connection between Emma's silence and her father's death. Emma had been there that night. She had witnessed the chaos, the fear, and the grief that had descended upon their family in the wake of Derek's death. The trauma had shattered Emma's world in a way that no one could have prepared for. But what Sarah hadn't realized until now was that it wasn't just the loss of her father that had caused Emma's silence. It was the horror of knowing that her father had been taken from them because of the very people who had perpetuated the cruelty that Luna had suffered. Emma's silence, her inability to speak after her father's death, was a manifestation of the trauma she had experienced. She had lost her father in the most violent, unjust way possible. The world around her had shattered, and no words could fill the void left in her heart. The memory of Derek's death, the questions that had been left unanswered, had become too heavy for Emma to bear. Her silence was her way of processing the unbearable, of trying to make sense of a world that had torn her family apart. It was in that moment that Sarah realized the depth of Emma's suffering. The little girl she had been trying so desperately to protect had carried a burden far heavier than Sarah had ever known. Emma had witnessed the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that had stolen her father's life and left her with nothing but questions and an unhealable wound. Her silence was not a choice. It was a defense mechanism, a way for Emma to cope with the trauma that had nearly destroyed their family. Sarah's heart broke for her daughter and for the man who had given his life to expose the truth. She now understood that Derek had been the one who had planted the seeds of resistance in Emma, the one who had shown her the importance of standing up for what was right. And though he had paid the ultimate price for it, Emma was now faced with the same choice Derek had made, to stay silent or to find her voice again. The truth about Luna's past and the secrets buried in Pineville were intertwined with Derek's death in ways Sarah could no longer ignore. She could no longer pretend that their lives were untouched by the shadows of the past. The connections were too clear, the stakes too high. As Sarah sat in the dim light of their home, the weight of the truth pressing down on her, she made a vow to herself and to Emma that she would uncover the full extent of the story. She would find the answers they had been denied. She would bring justice for Derek, for Luna, and for the countless others who had suffered in silence. And most importantly, she would help Emma find her voice again, no matter how long it took. Together, they would face the darkness that had haunted their family for too long. Luna's labor started quietly, the early signs subtle but unmistakable. The German Shepherd had been resting peacefully in the spare room Sarah had set up for her, and for a few days, her condition had improved. She was still weak, but the food, the warmth, and the quiet care Sarah had provided were slowly bringing her back from the brink. Emma had taken a special liking to Luna, often sitting beside her, her small hand resting gently on the dog's side as she whispered quiet words of comfort. It seemed as if Emma, too, was beginning to heal, finding solace in caring for the animal that had suffered so much. But that morning, Luna's breathing had changed. It was deeper, more strained. Her belly was visibly swollen, and the muscles along her sides tensed with each contraction. Sarah had been in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for Emma when she first heard the soft whimpering coming from the room. She dropped the frying pan onto the counter and rushed toward the spare room, her heart racing with sudden panic. Luna was lying on the floor, her body twitching slightly with each contraction. She let out a low growl of discomfort, her body tense. Sarah knelt beside her, gently stroking Luna's head. The dog's eyes met hers, filled with both pain and trust. Luna wasn't just giving birth. She was fighting for her life. Sarah could feel it in the dog's every movement, the fragility of the situation. "Hang in there, girl," Sarah whispered, her voice a tremor of fear. "You're not alone. We're here." Sarah had no idea what she was doing, but she knew one thing. Luna had already been through so much, and she wasn't about to let her suffer alone. The faint sound of Emma's footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Sarah quickly called out for her daughter. "Emma, stay close. Luna's in labor. We need to stay calm and help her." Emma nodded, her small face drawn with concern, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. She moved to Luna's side without a word, her fingers lightly grazing the dog's fur. There was a quiet understanding between them, as if Emma knew, deep down, that this moment was as much about Luna's survival as it was about her own. The contractions grew stronger, and Luna let out a soft cry of distress. Sarah could see the fear in her eyes, and her protective instincts flared. She gently massaged the dog's sides, trying to comfort her. But it was clear that Luna was struggling. She wasn't able to push on her own. There was something wrong. Just as Sarah was about to call for help, there was a sudden knock at the door. It was firm, authoritative. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she stood, her protective instincts kicking into overdrive. Who would be at the door at this hour? With a glance at Emma, Sarah moved quickly to the front of the house. When she opened the door, she was met with the sight of two local law enforcement officers, their uniforms crisp and their expressions unreadable. They stood on the porch, their hands resting at their sides, but Sarah immediately felt the weight of their presence. Something about them felt off. She couldn't explain why, but her intuition screamed that their arrival wasn't just a simple visit. "Good morning, ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice too smooth, too calm. "We've received a report about an injured animal at this address. We're here to assess the situation." Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea who could have reported Luna. They had kept her rescue a secret, at least as far as she knew. And yet here they were, standing on her porch, with their questions, their concern not for Luna's well-being, but for something else. "Luna's fine," Sarah said quickly, trying to mask the unease in her voice. "She's just giving birth. It's a difficult labor. We're doing the best we can." The officer's eyes flicked past her toward the open door, as if searching for something. "We'd like to take a look at the situation, if you don't mind," he said, his tone just shy of demanding. "It's standard procedure. Animal cruelty investigations, you know. Can we come in?" A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The mention of animal cruelty made her blood run cold. She wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what they were insinuating. They weren't here to help. They weren't here to check on Luna's well-being. They were here to make sure she was disposed of, that their involvement in Project Endurance was kept buried. Sarah's mind raced as she weighed her options. "Actually," Sarah began, trying to remain calm, "Luna is very weak right now. She's in labor, and I can't risk her getting stressed. I'm sure you understand." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of irritation crossing his features. He exchanged a brief look with his partner, who stood silently, his arms crossed. "Ma'am, this is a matter of public safety," the officer said, his voice turning colder. "We have our orders." Orders. The word sent a jolt of realization through Sarah's body. This wasn't a routine checkup. They weren't concerned about Luna's health. They were concerned about something far more sinister. Sarah's stomach churned with a rising sense of dread. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave," she said, her voice firm now, every inch of her body screaming to protect Luna. "Luna is in critical condition. If you don't leave, I'll have to call my lawyer." The officer took a step forward, his hand twitching toward his holster as if contemplating how far he could push before escalating the situation. But just as Sarah braced herself for the confrontation, Emma's voice rang out from behind her. "Mom? Luna's in trouble." Sarah turned toward her daughter, seeing the panic in Emma's eyes. Luna was crying out in pain, her body writhing as if it was fighting against an unseen force. Without thinking, Sarah stepped back inside, her heart racing. "I need you to leave," she said again more forcefully. "Luna's giving birth, and I won't let you make her situation worse." The officer hesitated, his gaze hardening. "You'll regret this, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with a hidden threat. "This is bigger than you think." With that, he turned and walked off the porch, his partner following suit. But Sarah couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. The officers had made no effort to check on Luna. There had been no concern for her health or the puppies she was about to give birth to. They hadn't even tried to make sure she wasn't in immediate danger. All they had cared about was intimidation, about silencing anyone who might dare to uncover the truth. Sarah slammed the door shut, her hands shaking as she turned back to Luna. The dog's breathing was labored now, each contraction sending a tremor through her body. The puppies were coming, and they had to hurry. There was no time to waste. Emma was at her side in an instant, her small hands trembling as she stroked Luna's fur. "We need to help her, Mom. We can't let them take her away." "I know, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're not going to let anyone hurt her." Together, they worked to keep Luna calm, doing everything they could to make sure the birth went smoothly. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The authorities were only a small part of the story. There was something bigger behind Luna's suffering, something far darker that had yet to be revealed. And as the first of Luna's puppies arrived, Sarah knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The forces at play in Pineville were not just looking to control Luna, they were looking to silence the truth forever. and Sarah would stop at nothing to uncover it. The sound of Luna's painful whimpers echoed through the small house as Sarah worked alongside her daughter to comfort her. The puppies were coming, but Luna was weak, struggling with each contraction. Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, but she refused to let fear take hold. She needed to stay strong, for Luna, for the puppies, and for Emma. She could feel her daughter's anxiety as Emma clung to her side, her small hands gently stroking Luna's fur. There was a bond between them now, something unspoken, as if the act of caring for Luna had helped heal something within Emma. But Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were being watched, that they were no longer in control of the situation. The visit from the officers earlier had left her unsettled. She had brushed it off at first, thinking it was just a coincidence. But now, as the night wore on and Luna's labor continued, Sarah couldn't ignore the reality. The local authorities were not just concerned about Luna's well-being, they were actively trying to suppress any investigation into her past. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. This time, Sarah knew who it was before she even reached the front porch. Officer Peterson's presence loomed over her like a shadow, his intentions clear as he stepped into view. She had seen him around town before, a familiar face with a clean-cut appearance and an air of authority that always seemed to carry an unspoken warning. But she had no idea just how deeply Peterson was tied to the military program that had used Luna. When Sarah opened the door, she was met with his cold, calculating gaze. He was tall and solid, his uniform impeccably pressed, his boots polished to a shine. There was no warmth in his expression, only the grim determination of someone who had already made up his mind. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and clipped, "I'm here to check on the animal in your care." Luna, was it? Sarah's stomach dropped at the mention of Luna's name. She had hoped that the officers would let the matter rest, but now it seemed they were tightening their grip. She forced herself to stay calm, stepping forward with a neutral expression. "She's fine," Sarah said, her voice tight. "She's in labor. There's no need for any more interference." Officer Peterson's eyes narrowed, and Sarah felt the weight of his gaze press on her, as if he was trying to gauge whether or not she was lying. He didn't move, didn't step back. Instead, he took a step closer, his body imposing in the doorway. "I'm afraid I can't let this go," Peterson said, his voice colder now, almost threatening. "We have orders to make sure that animal cruelty is investigated thoroughly. This is standard protocol, ma'am." Sarah's chest tightened as she realized what was happening. The investigation wasn't about protecting Luna or ensuring her safety, it was about silencing the truth. They wanted to cover up Luna's past, to keep her hidden away before anyone could learn what had truly been done to her. The realization struck her like a punch to the gut. The more she resisted, the more dangerous this situation would become. "I've already told you," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Luna is in critical condition right now. She's giving birth. She can't be moved." Peterson didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer again, his tone growing more insistent. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the gravity of this. You're harboring a dangerous animal, one with a history that could put you and your daughter at risk. This is not something you want to ignore." His words stung, but they didn't deter Sarah. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the town's complicity bearing down on her. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her into silence. But she also knew that the situation was becoming more dire by the minute. Luna's condition was worsening, and the risk of complications from the pregnancy was too great. If they didn't act quickly, the puppies and Luna both might not survive. "I'm not ignoring anything," Sarah snapped, her voice sharper now. "But I will not let you take her. Not now." Peterson's eyes flicked to the side, and Sarah followed his gaze. In the distance, she saw a black SUV parked by the side of the road. It was a dark, unmarked vehicle, one that didn't belong in Pineville. Sarah felt a wave of unease wash over her. She had seen that car before, but it wasn't until now that she realized its significance. The people inside that vehicle were not local law enforcement. They weren't even from the town. "They're not from here, are they?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peterson gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're smarter than you look, ma'am. No, they're not from here, But they've got more pull than you realize, and they're very interested in making sure that certain things stay quiet. The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt a chill settle deep in her bones. The realization that the forces she was up against were far bigger than anything she had anticipated hit her like a hammer. This wasn't just about Luna. This was about a cover-up, about protecting something much more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Luna was only the tip of the iceberg. What she had uncovered, the truth about Project Endurance, the military's involvement in cruel animal testing, was far more far-reaching than Sarah had ever thought possible. "You'll regret this," Peterson said, his voice low, almost a threat. "You're not the only one who can fight dirty." He turned to leave, but Sarah knew that the fight wasn't over. He was just the tip of the spear. The local authorities, the government, and the military were all in this together. They had already decided Luna's fate, and Sarah and Emma were nothing more than obstacles in their way. As Peterson walked back toward the SUV, Sarah's thoughts raced. She couldn't let them take Luna. She couldn't let them erase the truth, no matter how dangerous it would become. She had already lost so much. She wasn't about to lose her voice now. Inside, Emma was still with Luna, her hands steady as she continued to comfort the dog. But there was a quiet desperation in her eyes now, a recognition that things were escalating. She looked up at Sarah, her face pale, and Sarah could see the fear in her eyes. Emma didn't speak, but the silent question was clear. What happens now? "We're not giving up on Luna," Sarah said, her voice fierce, determined. "We're going to protect her, no matter what it takes." But deep inside, Sarah knew that this wasn't just about keeping Luna safe anymore. It was about something much bigger. The forces at play in Pineville were determined to keep the truth buried, and if Sarah and Emma were going to make it out alive, they would have to fight against everything the town stood for. The corruption was everywhere, woven into the fabric of the government, the police, and even the military. As Sarah watched Officer Peterson climb into the SUV and drive off into the distance, her resolve hardened. She knew this was only the beginning. The fight for Luna's life was just the first step. Now they would have to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy before it consumed them all. The night air was thick with tension as Sarah and Emma stood by Luna's side, the dog's weakened body resting against Sarah's legs. The puppies had been born, weak, fragile little creatures, but alive, and the room was filled with the soft sounds of Luna's labored breathing as she licked her newborns gently. Emma stayed close, her small fingers brushing Luna's fur as she watched over the dog. Sarah, though relieved for the moment, couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile peace was about to be shattered. As the night deepened, Sarah's mind continued to race, spinning with everything that had happened. She had a deep, gnawing fear that they were not alone, that someone had been watching them. The town had always felt like a quiet, sleepy place, but now it seemed that every shadow hid a secret, and the quiet whispers of conspiracy were far louder than she had ever imagined. Just as Sarah let out a sigh of relief, feeling a brief moment of hope for Luna and her puppies, a knock at the door shattered the silence. Sarah stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. Emma, sensing the change, moved closer to her mother, her eyes wide with concern. "I'll get it," Sarah whispered to Emma, though her voice was tight with apprehension. She moved cautiously toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the sense of dread that had settled over her never fully lifted. She opened the door slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. Standing on the other side was a tall man, dressed in a crisp military uniform, his face stern and unyielding. He stood straight, his posture rigid, and his eyes locked onto Sarah with a cold, calculating gaze. He was older than the officers who had come by earlier, his face sharp and his presence commanding. This was no ordinary law enforcement officer. Sarah could feel it the moment she laid eyes on him. This man was dangerous. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant James Keller," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I've been tracking Luna, and I need to speak with you." Sarah's stomach dropped. She had no idea how this man knew about Luna, but she could feel the weight of his words, the underlying threat that came with them. "What do you want with her?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sergeant Keller's expression remained unchanged. "Luna is a valuable asset, and she needs to be returned to us. I don't need to explain the details, but you're harboring a dangerous animal. I suggest you hand her over, and I'll make this as painless as possible." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced back toward the spare room where Luna rested, the puppies now sleeping beside her. She couldn't let him take her. She couldn't let them take Luna, not after everything she had learned, not after seeing the dog fight so hard to survive. "She's not a dangerous animal," Sarah shot back, her voice growing more confident. "She's a living creature, and she's been through enough already. I'm not giving her up." Sergeant Keller's eyes hardened. "You don't understand, ma'am. Luna was part of a project, an experiment. She's not just a pet. She's not just some stray. She was bred and tested for a very specific purpose, and that purpose is far more important than your emotional attachment to her." Sarah felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine at his words. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound strong. "What experiment? What are you doing to her?" Keller's lips twisted into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Project Endurance," he said flatly. "Luna was a test subject in a military program designed to create more resilient, loyal animals for special operations. We put them through hell to see how much they could endure, how far their loyalty could go. Luna was one of our best, but she failed the tests, and when she failed, she was discarded. Now she's a liability, and you're harboring her." A knot twisted in Sarah's stomach. She had suspected that Luna's past had been dark, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it spoken aloud in such a clinical, detached manner, made her feel sick. Luna wasn't just an innocent animal. She was a tool, a weapon that had been used and then thrown away when she was no longer useful. Sarah felt the rage rise inside her. Rage for Luna, for the countless other animals who had suffered, and for the twisted people who treated creatures like nothing more than disposable objects. "I won't let you take her," Sarah said, her voice now full of defiance. "Luna has been through enough. You can't just take her away and pretend like she doesn't matter." Sergeant Keller's face darkened. "I can do more than take her, ma'am," he said, his tone now a quiet threat. "If you don't hand her over willingly, I will make sure that the authorities, your local police, your government, see this as obstruction. You'll be charged with harboring an illegal animal. Do you really want to face that? Do you think anyone will believe your story about saving some poor dog from a military project? You'll lose. They'll take everything from you. You'll have no choice but to give her up." Sarah's chest tightened. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't bluffing. He was willing to go as far as he needed to protect the project, to silence anyone who got in the way. But as she stood there, her mind raced. She couldn't let Luna be taken again. She couldn't let this man, this system, erase everything that had happened to her. The pain, the suffering, the cruelty of it all. If Luna went back into their hands, they would make sure she was silenced, erased, and her story buried once again. Sarah squared her shoulders and took a step forward, standing tall in front of the doorway. "You're wrong," she said, her voice firm. "I won't let you destroy her. You've already done enough. I won't let you get away with it." Sergeant Keller's eyes flickered for a moment, a flash of something dark passing through them. But then, without warning, he stepped forward, his hands moving to the side, as if to intimidate her, to force her to step aside. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't want to be on the wrong side of this." But Sarah stood her ground. "I'll fight for her," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'll fight until I can't anymore. You're not taking her from me." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sarah could feel the heat of Keller's glare, but she refused to look away. She wouldn't back down. Not now, not when Luna's life was on the line. Keller's jaw tightened as he seemed to consider his next move. Finally, he stepped back, his expression hardening even further. "This isn't over," he said, his voice like ice. "You're making a mistake, Sarah. And when you realize it, it'll be too late." Without another word, he turned and walked off the porch, his heavy boots echoing in the night air. Sarah didn't watch him leave. Instead, she turned back to Emma, who had been standing silently behind her the entire time. "Mom, what happens now?" Emma asked, her voice quiet, yet filled with a growing understanding of the danger they were in. Sarah knelt down, pulling Emma into a hug. Now we keep fighting, she whispered. We protect Luna, and we make sure no one silences her. But as Sarah looked back at Luna, her heart heavy with fear, she knew the fight was just beginning. The forces they were up against were bigger and more dangerous than anything they had imagined. And no matter what happened next, Sarah would not stop until the truth was exposed, no matter the cost. The air in the room felt suffocating as the tension between Sarah and the men who stood before her thickened. Her heart pounded fiercely against her ribs, but her resolve was unwavering. Officer Peterson had arrived just as Sarah had feared, stepping in alongside Sergeant Keller, his presence unmistakable, his cold eyes fixed on her with an unsettling sense of finality. "Ma'am, we're not asking," Officer Peterson's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. "You've been given every opportunity to do the right thing. Now you're making this harder than it has to be." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she stood in the doorway, blocking Keller's path to Luna. "I'm not giving her up. You can't just walk in here and take her. You're not taking Luna." Keller's lips curled into a thin, emotionless smile. "It's not your decision to make. She's part of something much bigger than you realize. It's over. She's coming with us." At the mention of something much bigger, Sarah's stomach twisted, and a deep, bitter rage simmered inside her. She had come to understand the grim reality of what Luna had endured, but hearing it from these men, hearing them speak of Luna like she was a mere object to be taken away, was too much. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not again. Not ever. "I'll fight you every step of the way," Sarah spat, her voice thick with defiance. "I'll expose what you've done, and I won't back down. Not for Luna, and not for my daughter." Officer Peterson stepped forward, his eyes narrowed in a way that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You don't have a choice. This is bigger than you, Sarah. You're in over your head. You think you can fight the system, but you're nothing compared to the people we answer to." Sarah's chest tightened, but her defiance only grew stronger. "I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not afraid of whatever system you represent. You may have all the power, but I have the truth, and that's something you can't hide forever." But as she spoke those words, a nagging doubt twisted in her mind. Officer Peterson's connection to Keller, to the military, to the hidden program, they were too well entrenched in the system, too powerful. She could see now that this wasn't just about Luna. This was about maintaining control, about burying the truth, about making sure that no one ever uncovered the horrors of Project Endurance. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Peterson growled. "You're making this worse for yourself. We gave you a chance to do this the easy way." "Get out of my house," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking with anger. "You've already done enough. You've torn apart lives and you think you can just keep doing it? Not anymore. I won't let you." Keller took a step forward, his expression unchanging. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Sarah. You've made a mistake, but we'll fix it for you. For all of us." His eyes flicked to Peterson, who gave him a slight nod. And that was when it hit Sarah like a gut punch. Their partnership was more than just professional. They were allies in a far more dangerous game, one that she had barely begun to understand. They weren't here to enforce the law. They were here to make sure the truth stayed buried. Peterson's hand moved toward his holster, his fingers brushing the grip of his weapon. It was a subtle move, but it was enough. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She could see the clear threat in his gesture. They were prepared to escalate things, prepared to do whatever it took to take Luna and silence her and them forever. Before Sarah could react, Emma's voice, small but strong, rang out from the other side of the room. "No, you can't take her. You've already hurt her enough." Emma stepped forward, her eyes wide but filled with a fierce resolve. "She's not just an experiment. She's a dog. She's a part of our family." Keller paused, his eyes flicking to Emma, his gaze hardening. "This is not a matter of family, young lady. It's about keeping things under control. There are things you don't understand, things you're not ready for." But Emma didn't back down. She moved forward, standing beside her mother, her small but determined figure defying the men who stood before them. "No, I understand," Emma cried out, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "You hurt her. You hurt her for a reason. She was just an animal to you, but she's not. She's my friend, and you can't take her away." The words hit Sarah like a wave of strength. Emma had found her voice. The silence that had gripped her for so long had shattered. Emma had seen the truth, and now she was fighting for it. She was standing beside Sarah, no longer the scared little girl hiding from the world. She was defiant. She was brave. She was ready to protect Luna at all costs. Seeing her daughter so resolute reignited Sarah's own fire. The love she had for Emma, for Luna, and the deep sense of justice that had been buried under years of grief and loss surged within her. She would not let them take another thing from her. "We'll fight you," Sarah said, her voice filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. "We'll fight until the truth is out. We won't let you keep this secret any longer." Keller's eyes flashed with irritation, and Peterson's hand tightened on his weapon. But just as the tension reached a boiling point, something unexpected happened. The door swung open, and a figure stepped into the room, a familiar face from the town. It was Will, the local mechanic, along with several other residents of Pineville, people Sarah had known for years, people who had witnessed Luna's suffering and had been quietly supporting her cause from the shadows. Will's voice was firm and resolute as he stepped forward. "They're not alone," Will said, his voice ringing with authority. "You won't silence them. You won't silence the truth." Behind him, others from the town began to appear. A small crowd had gathered outside Sarah's home, people who had heard the whispers, seen the injustice, and were ready to stand up. The local barista, a young mother, a few elderly residents, all of them had come together, united by one thing: the desire to see the truth exposed. "We've known something wasn't right for a long time," Will continued, his voice rising. "But we stayed quiet. We didn't think we could do anything. But now, we know we can. We're not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The room seemed to hold its breath. Peterson and Keller exchanged looks, their faces darkening with frustration. They had expected to intimidate Sarah, to crush her resolve, but they hadn't accounted for the strength of the community. The people who had been quietly watching, who had been afraid to speak out, were now finding their voices. And it was more powerful than any threat Keller or Peterson could throw at them. With the eyes of the community upon them, the officers knew they were losing control. They had come to silence the truth, but they hadn't anticipated a town that was no longer afraid. A town that was ready to stand together, to confront the lies that had been hidden for far too long. Keller took a step back, his face flushed with rage. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You've made a grave mistake, and you'll regret it." But the moment he turned to leave, something shifted. The community had spoken, and Sarah, Emma, and Luna were no longer alone. As the door slammed behind them, Sarah felt a sense of relief flood her body. They had won, for now. But more than that, she knew the truth was on their side. The town was with them, and together they would expose the corruption that had stained Pineville and the people who had thought they could control it. As Emma wrapped her arms around her mother, holding on to Luna's fragile form, Sarah realized that this was just the beginning. The fight for Luna's life was over for now, but the fight for justice, for the truth, had only just begun. And they were ready for whatever came next. This character deserves a like for their strength and determination, but sadly, they haven't received it yet. Show your support now. The dust had barely settled in Pineville when the truth about the military experiments, Project Endurance, was finally exposed. The news spread like wildfire, shocking the tight-knit community to its core. The investigation uncovered the deep ties between the military, local law enforcement, and several high-ranking officials who had been involved in the cover-up. Many of those who had tried to silence Sarah and Emma, who had attempted to hide the truth, were arrested or dismissed from their positions. The town had been rocked by the realization that they had been complicit in a system of cruelty, a system that had operated right under their noses, hidden in plain sight. For Sarah and Emma, the aftermath of the exposure was both liberating and painful. The town that had once felt like a peaceful, quiet place was now a battleground, its darkest secrets laid bare for everyone to see. The people they had trusted, the officers, the officials, had betrayed them. But despite the anger and the betrayal, there was a sense of justice in the air. The truth had been revealed, and those responsible were being held accountable. Sarah watched as the community began to heal, slowly at first. The residents who had stood behind her and Emma during the confrontation rallied around them, offering their support, their apologies, and their help in rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't just about Luna anymore. It was about Pineville reclaiming its soul, its integrity. It was about the power of truth and the courage it took to fight for what was right. But while the town began to mend, Sarah and Emma knew that the road ahead would not be easy. They had lost so much. Luna's future remained uncertain. The emotional scars from everything they had endured, the pain of betrayal, the terror of being hunted, the loss of trust, would take time to heal. Yet despite the darkness they had faced, Sarah knew that something had shifted in their hearts. The bond between her and Emma had never been stronger. They had fought together, survived together, and in the process, had learned to trust each other in ways they never had before. Emma, once a quiet, withdrawn child, had found her voice, not only for herself, but for those who couldn't speak out. Sarah had watched her daughter grow stronger, more confident, and she knew that the child she had tried so hard to protect had become her greatest ally, her greatest strength. As they stood side by side, looking out over the town that had once seemed so familiar, Sarah realized that while they had sacrificed much, they had also gained something invaluable. The courage to stand up, the love to fight for each other, and the unbreakable bond that would carry them through whatever came next. The fight had been long and painful, but it had forged them into something new, stronger, braver, and more resilient than they had ever been before. And no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The days following the revelations in Pineville were a whirlwind of change. Investigators, journalists, and rescue organizations poured into the town, eager to learn more about the now infamous Project Endurance. But amidst the chaos and the healing, Sarah focused on what mattered most: her family and the fragile new lives that had come into the world. Luna, once battered and broken, had begun to recover. Though still skittish at times, she seemed to sense that she was finally safe. She no longer flinched at every sudden movement. She began to eat more, sleep peacefully, and rest her head on Emma's lap without fear. The trauma would always be a part of her, etched into her bones and scars, but she was no longer defined by it. The puppies, bright-eyed and full of life, quickly became the heart of the town's healing. People who had once turned a blind eye to Luna's suffering now stepped forward to help, eager to adopt the little ones and give them the lives their mother had never known. Each puppy went to a loving home, placed with families who understood what they represented, not just second chances, but the power of standing up and doing what was right. Luna, too, was given a choice. A quiet family from out of town, a retired veterinarian and his partner, offered to adopt her and give her the calm, healing environment she needed. They had followed the story from afar and had fallen in love with Luna's resilience. It was a difficult decision for Sarah and Emma, who had grown so attached to her, but they knew in their hearts that this was what Luna deserved: a life far from institutions and shadows, where she could run through open fields and rest in soft grass without fear. On the day Luna left, the town gathered to see her off. Sarah and Emma knelt beside her, saying their goodbyes through tears and laughter, showering her with gentle touches and whispered words of love. Luna looked back only once, her eyes meeting Emma's with a glimmer of understanding, of gratitude that transcended words. As the car pulled away, Emma stood in silence, her small fingers clutching Sarah's hand. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving mother and daughter alone on the porch. Then, after all the months of silence, Emma turned her head toward Sarah, her voice a soft, determined murmur carried on the wind. "I promise, Mom, I'll never let injustice win." Sarah's breath caught, her eyes welling up with tears. It wasn't just the sound of Emma's voice that moved her, it was the certainty in it, the strength that had come from so much pain and the hope that had bloomed in its place. She dropped to her knees, embracing her daughter, holding her close as they watched the last of Luna's journey begin. A new chapter had opened, not just for Luna and her puppies, but for Sarah, for Emma, and for the town of Pineville. It was at last a new beginning. The days stretched gently into weeks, and Pineville began to quiet again. The chaos had passed, but the echoes of what had happened still lingered. For Sarah, life settled into a slower rhythm. one that allowed her to breathe, to reflect, and most importantly, to watch her daughter begin to heal. Emma was still quiet. Her voice didn't return all at once, nor did the weight she carried disappear overnight. But the difference was undeniable. Where there had once been silence, now there were small moments, soft hums while coloring, whispered words when she thought no one was listening, a look in her eyes that spoke of cautious hope instead of deep, unreachable sorrow. The healing was slow, uneven, and at times painful, but it was real. Every morning Emma would ask about Luna, now living peacefully on a quiet farm just a few towns away. They had promised to visit, and the pictures the new owners sent were a balm to Emma's heart. Luna running through fields of tall grass, her puppies tumbling behind her. Emma kept those photos in a small scrapbook by her bed, flipping through them each night before sleep. Luna's journey became Emma's anchor. If Luna could survive the worst and still find joy, then maybe she could too. Sarah sat with Emma every evening now. They talked, not always with words, but in shared stories, drawing, music, tiny expressions that slowly built a bridge between mother and daughter. When Emma did speak, it was often in fragments, a memory, a fear, a wish spoken just above a whisper. One night, while tracing her finger along a photo of Luna curled around her puppies, Emma finally looked up. "I was scared all the time," she said softly, voice trembling. "After Daddy, I thought if I talked, something bad would happen again." Sarah's heart broke, but she kept her voice steady. "It's okay to be scared, but you're safe now, and I'm here, always." Emma nodded, tears in her eyes. She didn't say more, but she leaned into Sarah's arms, allowing herself to be held. With each passing day, Emma began to open up more about her dreams, her fears, her love for animals, and her desire to help others the way she had helped Luna. She began writing again, short stories about animals finding their way home. Her schoolwork improved, her laughter, once rare, returned in soft bursts, and Sarah watched all of it with awe. Luna had been more than a rescue. She had been a mirror, a reminder that healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain, it means choosing to move forward in spite of it. For Emma, Luna's presence had symbolized everything she had lost, and everything she still had to live for. The little girl who had once drowned in silence was learning to speak again. Not because the world had suddenly become safe, but because she had found her strength inside the storm. The seasons shifted in Pineville, and with them, so did Sarah and Emma. What had once been a life defined by survival had transformed into one shaped by purpose. The fear that once lingered in the corners of their home had been replaced with something else: conviction, courage, and a quiet but powerful hope. Sarah never imagined she'd become a voice for others. She had spent most of her life keeping her head down, trying to protect Emma and herself from further hurt. But everything that had happened with Luna changed that. The cover-up, the lies, the silence, it had all demanded a response, and Sarah had decided she would no longer stay quiet. With Emma by her side, Sarah began speaking out. They shared their story at local town halls, at schools, in neighboring communities. At first, her voice shook, but the more she spoke, the stronger it became. They told the truth, not just about Luna and the cruel experiments, but about the power of standing up when it matters most. Emma, too, found her rhythm. Though her voice was still soft, it carried weight. She would speak after her mother, sometimes reading poems or short stories she had written about animals and healing, sometimes simply sharing her feelings about what Luna had meant to her. People listened, not just to what they said, but to the emotion behind it. Together, they were a living testament to the power of compassion and resilience. Soon, they partnered with local shelters and advocacy groups, pushing for legislation that protected animals from exploitation and abuse. They helped fundraise for veterinary care, volunteered at rescues, and worked with other survivors, human and animal alike, who had once been voiceless. Their home, once filled with silence and shadow, became a sanctuary. Photographs of Luna and her puppies adorned their walls, alongside letters from those they had inspired. Emma even began planning a small book, a collection of her stories, titled Voices That Were Once Quiet, dedicated to Luna. Though Luna now lived on a peaceful farm, she was never far from their lives. They visited often, and Luna would greet them with joyful barks and knowing eyes, as if she remembered every heartbeat they had shared. She had found peace. but she had also given them theirs. One quiet afternoon, as Sarah and Emma sat in their garden, watching butterflies drift between the flowers, Emma turned to her mother. "Do you think Luna knows what she did for us?" she asked. Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "I think she always knew. She saved us as much as we saved her." And it was true. The bond between Sarah, Emma, and Luna had not only survived the storm, it had become the beacon that lit the way forward. Their love had been forged in darkness, but it had emerged into something powerful. Something that spoke louder than cruelty, louder than silence, louder than fear. It spoke of hope, of healing, and of a future forever changed by the courage to care. Though Luna was safe and justice had been served in Pineville, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. The arrests, the hearings, the headlines, it had all felt like a victory. But beneath the surface, Sarah sensed something deeper remained untouched. The military had disavowed Project Endurance, labeling it a rogue operation, a tragic anomaly. Yet too many files had vanished, too many names gone unmentioned. And Sergeant Keller had disappeared without a trace. Some nights, Sarah would lie awake, wondering how high the corruption had climbed, how many others like Luna were still suffering in hidden facilities far from the public eye. There were whispers, anonymous tips, untraceable emails, vague warnings from sympathetic insiders. Every now and then, she'd get a strange call that ended in silence. A shadow lingered over their hard-won peace, a constant reminder that justice for one dog didn't mean the battle was over. Emma had started smiling again, returning to school, writing stories, dreaming about becoming a vet. Their lives had begun to rebuild around hope and purpose. Yet Sarah knew they were still being watched, if not by Keller himself, then by someone with a vested interest in ensuring silence. They had opened a door the world hadn't wanted to see. And though Sarah and Emma had stepped into the light, they couldn't forget that darkness still waited beyond it, silent, patient, and unfinished. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sun dipped low over Pineville, casting a warm golden hue across the fields as Sarah and Emma stood together on the edge of their property. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the air, and in the distance, birds wheeled across the sky, free, unburdened. It was a peaceful moment, one hard-earned, and Sarah held it close. But she knew peace, like justice, was fragile. Beside her, Emma clutched a worn notebook filled with stories and drawings, dreams sparked by Luna, by loss, and by love. Her eyes, once dimmed by grief, now shone with quiet determination. She had found her voice, and with it, a mission. They had exposed the truth, saved Luna, and inspired a community. But the systems that had allowed the cruelty, the lies, the silence, the unchecked power, still loomed, just out of sight. Somewhere, more voices were still being silenced. Somewhere, others like Luna were waiting for someone to speak for them. Sarah felt the weight of that truth settle on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a calling. She and Emma had come too far to stop now. As the sky deepened to dusk, Emma turned to her mother and said softly, "We helped one. Now we help the rest." Sarah smiled, pride and purpose rising in her chest. She reached out and took Emma's hand. Together, they looked toward the horizon, not with fear, but with fire. The battle had been won, but the fight for justice had only just begun. Please consider subscribing to our channel and supporting our team. Share this video with your friends and family, like it, and comment below to share your thoughts. Would you like to see a part 2 of this story? Let us know what you think, and we appreciate your continued support.